Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and I've been reading about mental escalators of violence in U.S. policy and media makers. And the idea is that if we get more familiar with the mental escalators of violence, which make the decision to use violence more likely, we can apply this knowledge not only to U.S. policy and media makers, but to policy and media makers in Russia and in Ukraine. But I'll be focusing on the U.S. And this is called Part 4B, a competitive threat orientation towards international relations. Psychological patterns described by Lakoff, Spranger, and Allport. So I'll introduce these three different patterns, and I'll be referring back to them in later essays. Now, all of the endnotes for this will probably be posted on countercurrents.org, like the other essays, so you can find the sources there. Now, each of these about 20 essays here on the mental escalators starts with a bias, so this is false bias number 2. Life is competition. The goal is to beat adversaries and stay on top. Let's take a look at actual representative lines from Damon Wilson's 2019 testimony, 2 years before he became president of the National Endowment for Democracy, and 3 years before Russia's military action in Donetsk, Lugansk, and Ukraine. As we do so in this and the next several essays, I'll point out several biases that I find in Wilson's way of thinking, a pattern of thinking common to many of the minds that are forever leading our foreign policy. So I'm just using him as an example. These biases of thought, cognitive biases, skew the mind and allow only certain perceptions of life, international relations, and human dynamics. I read about them at greater length and with more examples in my unpublished works, but I'll provide some condensed ideas here. Wilson opens his January 29, 2019 testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee for the Senate hearing of the National Defense Strategy by stating, quote, "In an era of great power competition, the United States should adopt a more permanent deterrence posture and bolster its alliances as a strategic comparative advantage over our adversaries." End quote. He later proclaims, quote, "Our nation and its closest friends agree that the great challenge of the 21st century will be the competition between the free world and authoritarian, corrupt, state-led capitalism, chief among them China and Russia." End quote. Now, right off the bat, we see that Wilson views international relations in terms of competition. Of course, some will immediately mock my observation as indicating naivete and unrealistic softness, when hard is what's needed in foreign policy. But I stand my ground. This competitive view, as well as the conviction of the value of hardness, are both imbalanced views that are particularly dysfunctional in U.S. foreign policy. The psychological preoccupations have serious effects on foreign policy, effectively choking off the potential for U.S. foreign policy to ever be egalitarian, cooperative, and genuinely friendly. The competitive view is an attitude that ran rampant throughout the infamous document calling for an expansion of the American Empire, written by the neoconservative Project for the New American Century, PNAC, which we discussed in the previous essay, Part 3B. Recall just one of PNAC's numerous quotes that revolve obsessively around domination and supremacy. Quote, "At present, the United States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible." End quote. It's a view, I would emphasize, that is notably not a feature of the writings and speeches of Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who is instead characterized throughout mainstream U.S. media as the evil bad guy seeking conquest. In Putin's 2007 Munich speech, falsely characterized as infamous, his July 2021 essay, falsely characterized as notorious, and his February 21 and 24 2022 speeches, there's not one indicator that Putin possesses a competitive outlook on international relations. In fact, he continually calls for cooperation for the peaceful resolution of problems, for disarmament, and for worldwide respect for international law. He plainly appeals to universal standards of morality and international law for the benefit of the planet, not, as U.S. experts would have us believe, for favors and power for Russia. Why is Putin so falsely represented in the U.S. media? Much of it may be due to U.S. policy and media makers' deliberate attempts to deceive Congress and to deceive the American and world public. Some may be influenced by their familiarity with corruption and decreasing human rights in Russia. They may assume the leader of such a nation has malicious goals for the world. Much may be due to these so-called U.S. experts' inability to read or comprehend his works and listen to his speeches. And when I'm saying this, I'm not speaking just of Wilson now. I'm talking about the media in general, where they all characterize Putin and his speeches and essays as saying things that they don't say. So their reading comprehension skills may be poor. Perhaps they never bother to read his material and simply parrot one another, assuming the other guy has the right answers to the test. Much may be due to the mindless habit of American conformity, peer pressure, and groupthink, a conspicuous habit noticed by foreign visitors to the United States even back in the 1800s, and a habit that strangulates freedom of the press and true freedom of mind, as remarked with concern by the leading Islamist theoretician Syed Qutb during his own visit to the U.S. 70 years ago. But Americans are supposed to think that Islamists are mindless tyrants who hate freedom, while Americans bask in freedom and enjoy something called democracy, which only exists in the most shallow sense. But there could be another reason, a subconscious reason why these so-called U.S. experts slander Putin's words. Notice what the competitive outlook does to one's brain. Feel what happens in your own brain as you pretend to have this view, if you don't already. This worldview, an extremely self-centered worldview, has the effect of constructing psychological barricades to the very idea of perceiving international relationships in terms of friendship, cooperation, and egalitarianism. To U.S. foreign policy makers whose minds are immersed in self-centered competition, the only acceptable form of cooperation equates not to an egalitarian two-way street type of caring and collaboration, but to the expectation that foreign nations and fellow Americans submerge their own interests and ideas to conform to U.S. policymaker interests. To their minds, if Putin's ideas do not conform to the dictates of U.S. policymakers, dictates such as their insistence that U.S. violence abroad is acceptable even if it violates international law, that the U.S. militarization of space is acceptable, then his ideas are not perceived as valid, helpful, thoughtful, wise, or even worthy of discussion. They're only considered adversarial. Because if you're not conforming, you're competing. That's the only other option in their minds. The obsessively competitive mind is incapable of recognizing as valid those ideas that are different from their own. Even the ideas of Putin that are much more likely than U.S. policymakers' ideas to bring the world closer to a state of justice, freedom, and peace. Personally, Wilson's way of viewing the world as a competitive place strikes me as bizarre. I can't imagine writing a paper for Congress that sees the world in terms of competition, deterrence postures, bolstering alliances, and comparative advantages. None of these terms would be in my thinking. Even if I were writing for the Armed Services Committee, I'd be writing about the need to bolster understanding, mutual caring, mutual communication, foreign language abilities, and friendship, as well as fun activities amongst the populations of different nations that can encourage feelings of joy, friendship, and caring. After all, we already have enough weapons. 4,000 nuclear warheads is 4,000 too many. In fact, as Greg Mortensen writes in 3 Cups of Tea, the U.S. military itself recognized that his building schools in Pakistan could do a lot more for world peace than they're building more missiles. And what's the point in overkill? Perhaps if this were the 1700s, we'd be thinking more about building up an arsenal to defend, not expand, the borders. But at this point, what we need isn't more weapons and rivalry, but more understanding, friendly social connections, positive human dynamics, and fun and helpful activities to make life worth living. That's what's missing. Wilson and others in the social and business circles that run our foreign policy probably don't realize that their competitive view of international relations is only their skewed perception, not truth. In terms of psychology and sociology, there are probably various diagnoses and theories that could be applied to this pattern of thinking, and we'll look at a few here. I'm not suggesting that Wilson himself can definitely be identified as having these patterns of thought, but his mention of competition is quite striking, and it brings up a theme commonly echoed about amongst foreign policy and media makers, a theme that's worth addressing. I would say that all of U.S. foreign policy for the past few centuries has much in common with what George Lakoff terms the strict father model of human relations in his work, Moral Politics. Adherents to the strict father model automatically view life and relationships in terms of hierarchy, top-down rules, competition, obedience, rewards, and punishments. To their false way of thinking, this is the only reasonable, mature, and realistic way to view life and to view international relations. Adherents of the strict model believe that competition is necessary in order to essentially bring out the best in people in terms of morality, quality, and behavior. We never see evidence in U.S. foreign policy of the other model Lakoff describes, the Nurturant mother model. The Nurturant model especially values mutual understanding, caring, open lines of communication, and equality. Incidentally, in my own unpublished series, I modify the models' names to simply strict model and Nurturant model, because while Lakoff undoubtedly has good reasons for his labels, there are plenty of nurturant, understanding fathers and strict authoritarian mothers, and I hate to have inaccurate gender stereotypes damage people's sense of identity and their potential for love and caring. As mentioned in the earlier essay on PNEC, this competitive view corresponds closely with what Eduard Spranger described long ago as the political value, or political lenses of life, which cause people to view life in terms of hierarchy, control, domination, and status. Yet Spranger describes 6 such values, and there's absolutely no need or sense in having those with just one of those 6 values, the political value, dominating our foreign policy making. In fact, this is dangerous. Those who see life through what Spranger calls social, aesthetic, or theoretical lenses, for example, would be much more qualified and capable of creating U.S. foreign policy grounded in empathy, equality, caring, truth, and honesty, without the emphasis on rivalry, superiority, and authoritarianism. Significantly, and it's ironic because some of these people, say in NED, they're pro-democracy, yet the approach can be very authoritarian towards other nations. You can't have an authoritarian approach about imposing democracy. It doesn't work. Significantly, researchers find that those who see life through political lenses are the most likely to be prejudiced against groups of people, as our foreign policy maker establishment incessantly exhibits towards Russians, towards concepts of the Nurturant model, and towards left-wing political ideas of egalitarianism and democracy in economics. Such Americans may claim they're not prejudiced in their views towards this and that ethnic population. They may claim they love diversity and pluralism, and then again they may not, but they are totally blind to their prejudice against Russians, especially Russian leaders who do not cave in to their self-centered ideas. Those who predominantly view life through political lenses are also most likely to have what Gordon Allport describes as the prejudiced personality, which involves an entire set of skewed cognitive habits of thinking provoked by an underlying threat orientation that tend to be conducive to hostility, difficult social relations, and less creative problem-solving skills. They might only think of weapons as the solution. Weapons. More weapons. Those with this personality are most likely to be prejudiced towards various groups of people and ideas, and their entire perception of truth is also distorted. For example, in his classic 1954 work, The Nature of Prejudice, Allport writes of experiments in which participants are repeatedly shown drawings of a cat, and picture by picture the cat gradually transforms into a dog. Those with a prejudiced personality are less likely to recognize this change while it's happening. Their minds stick to their initial belief that they're looking at a cat. This pattern of thinking affects our relationship with truth and with other beings. For example, Allport described several features of the prejudiced personality. Less empathic ability towards others. And notice these things in our U.S. foreign policy. First, less empathic ability towards others. For example, not understanding their fears. Tendency to blame others for problems and not take any blame oneself. Blaming Russia for this conflict and not the U.S. or NATO. Inability to handle frustration. Projection of self-hatred into hatred of others. Preoccupation with superiority and inferiority. Need for definiteness, not ambiguity. A preference for strict rules and hierarchy. An insistence upon cleanliness and morality. Support for authoritarianism. And again, U.S. policymakers may say they're against authoritarianism within Russia, but their own relations, even towards their fellow Americans, can be authoritarian, like in their meetings, and also towards other countries. Greater support for institutions and patriotism. Constrictedness in thinking. Black and white thinking, seeing good all on one side and bad all on the other, which is what they're doing now. Russia is evil. Ukraine and the U.S. and NATO are good. It's black and white thinking. It's not realistic. Selective perception, seeing and remembering that which supports what one already thinks. That may be why when they read his essays and speeches, they actually don't comprehend it, because they only see what they want to see and only remember what they want to remember, and they twist it. Simplification of memory traces, remembering in an erroneously simplified way, and clinging to past solutions, such as weapons. It's important to kindly and clearly raise awareness of the prejudiced personality and never allow its skewed perception of the truth to lead to harm and injustice, whether in foreign policy, the office, neighborhood, or home. Because of their suboptimal relations with people and with truth, those who adhere to Lakoff's strict model and those who have Allport's prejudiced personality are the types of people least likely to be successful in creating cooperative, harmonious, just foreign policy. Why then do we even allow such people to heavily populate our foreign policy making establishment? It's not as though we should be prejudiced ourselves and forbid their occupying foreign policy positions. They can contribute to discussion, and their ideas may certainly be helpful. But in no way should they be in the driver's seat of foreign policy, which is where they've been for about 2 centuries, as the U.S. initiates war after war, year after year, and nearly every year since its inception. If not with Native Americans, then with foreigners abroad. The other type of personality Gordon Allport describes, that is the opposite of the prejudiced personality, he calls the tolerant personality, or democratic personality, which also has its own set of cognitive habits. Ironically, perhaps this is why the U.S. government is so undemocratic. It is populated in its most powerful positions by undemocratic personalities whose obsession with rivalry, superiority, inferiority, and obedience completely obstructs their individual ability to create a democratic government. Of course, it may be difficult to even recognize this obsession with competition as imbalanced, because competition, and the blind belief that it always leads to improvement, is one of the primary unsubstantiated values promoted by U.S. culture. As Ruth Benedict wrote in Patterns of Culture, decades ago, from a large array of values and traits, each culture fosters certain values and traits and discards others. In his article, Tahitian Gentleness and Redundant Controls, Robert Levi writes that each culture emphasizes particular values, and those values are reinforced in many different settings and situations within that culture as a type of redundant control to reinforce those values. So present are these traits in so many aspects of life that they're assumed to be a normal part of human life. Yet it is the dominant traits that are most likely to grow monstrously out of proportion and to be in need of a good pruning, as Ruth Benedict says. In the U.S., competition, particularly competition for money, has wrapped its clinging vines around nearly every aspect of life, including learning, recreation, religion, employment, the media, social life, commerce, politics, and foreign policy, sometimes choking the very potential of each aspect of life to fully blossom and to develop human life in the direction of joy, love, and peace. And in foreign policy, the capacity for peace is suffocated by this drive to be the best and to be superior. Ironically, the cultural, economic, political, and military consequences of U.S. foreign policy is quite anti-competitive, as large corporations lead to the downfall of smaller competitors. Variety gives way to standardization. Propaganda leads to conforming, homogenized perspectives. And foreign nations themselves are all expected not to compete with the U.S. government, but to obey. So it is not competition that these U.S. leaders value. It is rather one-sided victory that they value, and the disappearance of all forms of threats, competition, and rivals that they so nervously perceive and misperceive in their surroundings. Imagine waking up one day to read our morning newspaper and find not talk that revolves incessantly around competition amongst nations for wealth, power, and status, but articles about Putin's personal efforts to protect wildlife in Russia. While those efforts are in fact true, perhaps there also would be other articles someday about interspecies friendships in the Congo between humans and bonobos, reptiles, birds, fish, and other mammals. Collaboration between Pakistan and India to uncover ancient fossils and unbombed land. Pedal cars and special roadways being developed in Latin America that use no fossil fuels whatsoever but build muscles. Joyful forms of cooperative recreation taking place between Russians and Americans that have nothing to do with gold medals. And new forms of music and dance being synthesized together by Israelis and Palestinians, without any contracts with agents seeking to profit. Wherever a nation's eyes focus, that's where the time and money will go. And if our U.S. foreign policy and media makers will continue to fill their ranks with people like themselves, with people suffering from these same psychological patterns, with people whose eyes perceive only competitive threats in the unknown and adversaries in those whose ideas are different, will continue to have an unnecessarily tough and unpleasant road ahead. Thank you very, very much for listening.